My son sent the message on a Tuesday morning while I was watering my plants. The text lit up my phone like a flare, simple and sharp. "We need space from you. Please don't reach out anymore at all." I read it twice before the meaning settled in, like frost on glass, slowly obscuring everything I thought I knew. The water kept spilling from the can onto my slippers, soaking my socks, but I didn't notice until the chill crawled up my legs. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake, maybe meant for someone else, maybe sent in anger that would fade. But there was no follow-up, no call, not even the 3 blinking dots that suggest someone is still typing. Just silence, wide and echoing, like the space he now claimed to need. I sat down at the kitchen table, my hand still clutching the phone like it might give me a better answer if I stared long enough. I'd always believed a mother's job was to show up, no matter what, no matter when, so I just sat there, dripping and quiet, not knowing what I was supposed to do with myself now. My name is Diane, and I'm a mother before I'm anything else. At least that's what I used to say, before that message, before the last 6 months reshaped everything I thought I knew. I'm 64, widowed, and live in a little yellow house in a cul-de-sac where the mailman knows my name and my dog's name too. My son, Caleb, is 36, a software engineer who used to call me every Thursday like clockwork. He married young, divorced young, and married again to a woman named Lacey, who I never quite figured out. She always smiled with her mouth, but never with her eyes, always left the room just before dessert, always changed the subject when I brought up anything real. Still, I showed up for every birthday, brought casseroles for every cold, offered to babysit even when they never took me up on it. I thought I was helping, thought I was part of their life, thought I mattered. Looking back now, I wonder if I was just background noise, the kind you forget you're hearing until it stops. And now, apparently, they wanted silence. If you have a similar story about betrayal from the people you least expect, tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. I didn't respond to Caleb's text right away. Didn't respond at all, actually. What do you say to something like that? To a child who has just erased you from the whiteboard of their life? I went about my day like a ghost, drifting through routines that suddenly felt like mimicry. Toast burned. Coffee went cold. My dog, Jasper, followed me around more closely than usual, as if he sensed that something had gone off in the wiring. I opened the hall closet and stared at the birthday gift I'd already wrapped for Caleb, a framed photo of us at Lake Erie the last time he laughed like he used to. I'd found the perfect blue paper with little golden stars and even tied a ribbon around it like my mother used to do. But now it felt ridiculous, almost desperate, like clapping for a play that ended years ago. I placed it back on the shelf and shut the door quietly, as if the noise might wake something best left asleep. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of the message, or at least not only because of it, but because of all the other little things that suddenly lined up behind it. The way Caleb stopped mentioning me in holiday plans. The way Lacey always corrected my stories in front of the kids. The way my granddaughter, Ivy, once asked me why I always came over when nobody invited me. I'd laughed it off at the time, told her that grandmas come whether they're invited or not. But the truth clung to her words like dust to drapes. I was always coming over. I was always inserting myself. And maybe they had been trying to tell me something all along. The next morning, I sat on the porch and watched the world go about its business. Children walked to school with backpacks too big for their shoulders, dragging sleepy dogs behind them. Mr. Harwell across the street mowed his lawn with military precision, like he always did on Wednesdays. The paperboy tossed the local Times into the puddle beside my hydrangeas. Everything was exactly the same, except it wasn't. I felt like I was behind glass now, like life was still happening but no longer for me. The world wasn't ending, but mine had cracked somewhere under the weight of a sentence I didn't know how to answer. I looked at Jasper, who was curled at my feet with his chin resting on his paws. "I guess it's just you and me now," I whispered, and he wagged his tail once, like that would be enough. I wished I believed it. I didn't reach out. Not the first day, not the second, not the entire first week. I wanted to. I wanted to text back something clever, something warm, something that might unlock whatever door had just slammed shut. But I didn't, because Caleb had asked for space, and for the first time, I decided to give it to him. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Not because of pride, not because of anger, but because I had spent 36 years being someone's mother. And now that someone wanted a version of life where I didn't exist. So I stayed quiet, sat with my own questions, drank tea I didn't taste, walked Jasper until our feet ached, and waited to feel something other than hurt. Day 10 arrived like a slap. I woke up and realized I had memorized the message. I could see the exact punctuation, the exact spacing, the way the word anymore hung like a guillotine. It wasn't just rejection, it was erasure. I'd been edited out of my own story, and the silence that followed felt like confirmation. I started wondering what I had done, where I had failed, how I had become so unwanted. Maybe it was the questions I asked about the kids, screen time. Maybe it was offering too much advice about their budget. Maybe it was the way I always showed up with leftovers. Maybe it was just me. Too much of me for too long. On day 12, I opened the hall closet again and took the gift down. It sat on the table while I drank my tea, daring me to unwrap it and pretend it was never meant for someone else. The photo inside had felt so important when I picked it, a reminder of better times, evidence that we had been happy once. Now it felt like proof of my own delusion. I placed the wrapped gift in the pantry next to the emergency flashlight and an expired box of graham crackers. That way I wouldn't see it every day, but I'd still know where it was. Just in case. Just in case what, Diane? In case he changed his mind? In case love worked like a rubber band and came snapping back if you just waited long enough? Room. I hated that hope still had a room in my heart. Jasper started acting anxious by week 3, as if he too felt the absence of the voices that used to fill our Sundays. He waited by the door around noon, the time Ivy and Caleb used to arrive with backpacks and juice boxes. I watched him through the window, tail wagging faintly, hope flickering in his posture. I almost told him to stop waiting. But then, I hadn't stopped either. I still checked my phone first thing every morning, hoping for a new message, an apology, anything to erase that final line. There was nothing. No calls, no texts, not even a forwarded meme or a mistyped accidental message. Silence had become its own language, and I was fluent now. By the time the first month passed, I'd memorized the rhythm of my own loneliness. Morning walks with Jasper, midday crossword, lunch alone, afternoon dishes, and evenings spent reading books I barely absorbed. I stopped mentioning Caleb to my sister June on our weekly calls because she always asked what I did wrong. Not out of cruelty, but from a belief that every cause has an effect. That mothers get what they earn. I didn't know how to explain that I'd spent my life loving too loudly, not too little. She had 3 sons, and none of them had ever pushed her away. She said it was because she gave them space, never interfered, always let them live their own lives. Maybe that was the difference. I had always wanted to be part of Caleb's life. June had always waited for an invitation. One rainy afternoon, I passed by the community center bulletin board and saw a flyer for a Writing Through Grief workshop. The word grief struck me like a stone, not because I'd lost a life, but because I'd lost a presence. I stood in front of the flyer for 5 full minutes, reading and rereading the date, the time, the bold letters at the top. I hadn't considered myself someone in mourning, but that was exactly what I was doing. Grieving the loss of a role, of a place, of a rhythm I'd taken for granted. I took a photo of the flyer with my phone and walked out into the rain without opening my umbrella. The cold felt earned, like I was finally honoring the ache instead of brushing it off with polite smiles and empty distractions. Maybe writing could help me make sense of it. Or maybe I just needed to be around people who understood this strange kind of loss. The workshop was held in the back room of the library, where the chairs were too small and the lighting too soft. There were 6 of us, all women, all holding notebooks with hesitant hands. A retired teacher named Bev, a quiet widow named Lorna, a teenager who didn't speak at all but kept drawing spirals in her journal, and me, sitting with a pen I hadn't used since Robert died. The instructor asked us to write about the thing we missed the most, not the person, but the thing. I thought of Caleb's voice when he used to call just to say hi. I thought of Ivy's drawings on my refrigerator and how she'd always ask me to rate them from 1 to 10. I thought of the way my living room used to smell like syrup on Sunday mornings after they left. I wrote down, I miss being needed, even if it was inconvenient. And for the first time in weeks, I cried without holding back. After the class, Lorna approached me while we walked to the parking lot. She asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime, and I surprised myself by saying yes. We met 2 days later at a cafe downtown, the kind that still uses real sugar cubes and has a chalkboard menu. We talked about our sons. Hers had died in a motorcycle accident 5 years ago. She told me how grief changes shape over time, how it never really leaves but just hides in different corners. I told her about the message, about the silence, about the ache of still being alive and unwanted. She didn't judge or offer solutions. She just listened, really listened, in the way only someone with their own scars can. When we finished our coffee, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand once, firmly. It was the kindest touch I'd felt in a long time. The day started stretching wider after that. Still quiet, still lonely, but not quite as sharp. I went back to the writing class and even shared one of my pages aloud. The instructor called my story restrained but devastating, which I took as a compliment. Jasper still waited by the door some days, but less often, as if he too was learning the new routine. I started writing letters to Caleb that I never sent. I kept them in a box labeled "Not for Delivery," tucked away in the drawer where I used to keep school pictures and macaroni crafts. Some letters were angry, others tender, all honest. It felt good to tell the truth, even if no one else heard it. There was something sacred in giving words to pain. Even silent stories deserve to be told. On the 42nd day since Caleb's message, I received a birthday card in the mail with no return address. It was a generic card, daisies on the front, a printed message about wishing me joy, with no signature. Just the words, "Happy birthday, Mom," written in Caleb's handwriting. No apology, no explanation, no message beyond the bare minimum to say he remembered I existed. It arrived 3 days after my actual birthday, which made the effort feel even thinner. I held the card between my fingers for a long time, as if more meaning might rise from the paper like heat. But there was nothing. Just ink and silence, and something that almost passed for guilt. I didn't call him, didn't text, didn't even put the card on the fridge, though that's where I used to display every drawing Ivy gave me. Instead, I tucked it into the drawer with the unsent letters, adding it to the pile of things I didn't know what to do with. Lorna called that evening, sensing something in my voice before I even said hello. I told her about the card, how it felt like a breadcrumb dropped without the promise of a trail. She said some people only reach out far enough to quiet their own conscience. And I think she was right. It wasn't about making peace. It was about easing his own guilt while keeping me at arm's length. Around that time, I started volunteering at the animal shelter down the road. It wasn't something I planned. I saw a flyer at the grocery store and called before I could overthink it. They had me folding towels and walking dogs the first week, and by the second, I knew every kennel by heart. There was a puppy named Rosie with a broken paw who cried unless I sat with hers. There was a grouchy beagle named Thatch who only responded to show tunes, which made the staff laugh every time I sang. It didn't fix anything, but it filled the long, aching gaps in my day with something warm, something grateful. Unlike the people I loved most, these animals never pushed me away. They just wanted to be near someone who wouldn't leave. And for the first time in months, I felt useful again. June came over for tea one Sunday, unannounced, like she used to when we were kids. She brought cinnamon rolls and a face full of questions. "I saw Caleb at the market," she said, not even waiting for me to sit. I stiffened, because I knew what came next would hurt, no matter how gently it was said. He didn't say much, but when I asked about you, he said, "We're taking a break from her." A break. As if I were a bad habit or a cluttered drawer that needed sorting. I asked June if he seemed angry or sad, hoping for some clue, some crack in the wall he'd built. She just shook her head. "No, Diane, he seemed relieved." That word clung to me like smoke, even after June left. Relieved. What kind of son feels relief at cutting off his mother? I ran the question around in my head like a stone in a tumbler, hoping it would smooth into something softer. It didn't. It just stayed sharp, especially when I remembered the way Caleb used to grip my hand during thunderstorms as a child. The same hand I used to press to his forehead during fevers. The same hand I used to carry every science fair model, every forgotten lunch, every piece of his world that needed holding. And now, that same hand was a burden, a memory he wanted space from. I sat with that truth until my tea went cold and the room fell dark around me. The next morning, I wrote Caleb another letter I wouldn't send. I told him about the shelter, about Rosie's limp, about how Thatch barked if I didn't sing "Hello, Dolly" on the dot at noon. I told him about the woman who ran the front desk, Maribel, and how she gave me a keychain shaped like a paw. I wrote about Jasper, who still glanced toward the window at 11:58 every Sunday, then sighed and curled back up. And I wrote about the way I'd started forgetting things. Not important things, just little ones, like whether I'd taken my vitamins or washed the laundry. But still, it scared me. I asked him if he ever worried about forgetting me, and then I tore the letter up, because I couldn't bear to know the answer. Some doors are safer closed, even when they have your child's name carved into them. That afternoon, I walked past Caleb's house. It was a 10-minute detour from the park where Jasper liked to sniff the same 3 bushes every walk. I hadn't been down that street since the message. The lawn was perfectly trimmed, the curtains drawn, the world behind those windows completely unknown to me now. I didn't linger, just kept walking, head high, even as my heart cracked a little more. There were no toys in the yard, no chalk drawings on the sidewalk, nothing to suggest children lived there. I remember the time Ivy made a hopscotch path with numbers that went up to 48. "Because regular hopscotch is boring," she'd said proudly. I'd taken a photo that day. It was still on my phone, untouched. I pressed my palm to my chest and kept walking. Later that week, I ran into an old neighbor from when Caleb was in grade school. Her name was Sharon, and she'd always smelled like cinnamon and peppermint. We chatted about weather and grocery prices, and then she asked, "How's that sweet boy of yours doing?" I smiled like I was wearing someone else's face. "Oh, you know how grown kids are. Busy, busy." She nodded, none the wiser, and changed the subject to her new grandson. But her question echoed for hours after we parted. "How was my sweet boy?" "Papo, I didn't know." And that was its own kind of grief. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. 3 weeks later, I received an email from Ivy's school. It was a general parent and grandparent newsletter, the kind that listed upcoming events and volunteer opportunities. I hadn't gotten one since the start of summer, back when I was still considered part of the family loop. At first I thought it was a mistake, maybe a leftover email that hadn't been removed yet. But then I saw a name listed under volunteers for the Fall Art Showcase. Lacey Patterson, event chair. She was never one to volunteer for anything when I offered to help, but now she was leading the event. I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of confusion and something sour I didn't want to name. I clicked through the link to see the showcase flyer. And there, at the bottom in bold letters, it said, "No outside family members beyond immediate household permitted this year." I sat in stunned silence, letting those words settle like wet cement. Immediate household. A neat little phrase that excluded me without ever using my name. It wasn't about COVID or capacity limits. Not when they were listing 25 volunteers and including school neighbors in the guest count. It was about drawing a boundary I couldn't cross, one so cleanly written it could be defended with a smile. Jasper barked from the other room, probably chasing a squirrel from the window, and I used it as an excuse to step away. But even as I rubbed his ears and told him he was a good boy, those words clung to me. They were another kind of text message. Softer, but just as final. Not wanted. Not even for an hour. That night, I opened a folder on my laptop I hadn't touched in months. It was called Family Photos, 1990s to Now, and it held hundreds of images I'd scanned and organized one Sunday afternoon last spring. There was Caleb with his front teeth missing, Caleb with a Band-Aid on his forehead from falling off his scooter, Caleb holding Ivy when she was no bigger than a loaf of bread. In most of the pictures, I was in the background, blurred, laughing, always watching. I scrolled through them slowly, not sure if I was soothing myself or punishing myself. Maybe both. Eventually, I stopped on a photo from Ivy's 5th birthday, the last party she begged me to bake the cake for. She'd asked for chocolate and purple icing and sprinkles shaped like stars. I remembered her face when she saw it, all teeth and joy and frosting on her cheeks. I closed the folder and shut the laptop before I started crying. The following morning, I wrote another letter I wouldn't send. This one was to Ivy. I told her about how much she loved frogs when she was little, how she used to draw them with big eyelashes and name them after cartoon characters. I reminded her of the time she spilled apple juice on my favorite couch cushion and tried to hide it with a throw pillow. I said I missed hearing her ask me to braid her hair, even though I always pulled a little too hard. I told her I understood if she didn't remember much, or if her parents had made it easier not to. But I wanted her to know she was always loved. Not the kind of love that depends on holidays or phone calls. The kind that stays, even when the door shuts in your face. And then I folded the letter and placed it in the same box as the others. One afternoon at the shelter, Maribel pulled me aside. She said, "You seem lighter lately, Diane. More yourself." I smiled, unsure whether it was true or just a kindness. But maybe it was both. I'd stopped checking my phone every morning, stopped circling the calendar with old traditions that no longer existed. Instead, I filled my time with dogs and people who remembered my name because they wanted to, not because they had to. I even started baking again, just for the staff. Banana bread, oatmeal cookies, and one peach cobbler that made Maribel tear up. It felt good to be good at something again, even in a small way. And when I left each day, I didn't feel like I'd been erased. Still, the loneliness never left entirely. It came at odd hours. While brushing my teeth, while peeling an orange, while folding the same towel for the 3rd time. It didn't shout or sob. It whispered. A gentle but constant reminder that something important had gone missing. Sometimes I dreamed of Caleb as a child, not the man who wrote that message, but the boy who asked me to read the same book 5 times in a row. He'd crawl into my lap and point to the pages he already knew by heart. "I like this part," he'd say, every single time. And now I wondered if he remembered any of it, or if I was the only one who kept those memories safe. Love, it seems, is often archived by the one left behind, and memory doesn't always ask for permission. A week before Thanksgiving, June called again. She said Caleb and Lacey were going out of town for the holiday, some kind of cabin rental near the mountains. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. "They didn't invite you?" she asked gently. "No," I said as simply as I could. She didn't push, but I could feel the worry in her silence. "I'll come to your place," she offered. "We'll make something small and pretend it's what we wanted all along." I smiled, because I knew she meant well, but pretending only works when everyone agrees to the script. And I was done pretending. On Thanksgiving morning, I woke up early and made pumpkin muffins with maple glaze. I set a table for 2, lit a candle, and placed a small vase of sunflowers in the center. June arrived with cranberry salad and a bottle of wine she couldn't pronounce. We ate, laughed, and didn't mention Caleb once. After she left, I took Jasper for a walk under gray skies that smelled like December. Leaves crackled underfoot, and the wind had that first whisper of winter in it. It wasn't the holiday I would have chosen. But it wasn't empty, and that, I decided, was enough for now. It had to be. December came faster than I expected, with shorter days and the kind of cold that makes your bones ache. I decorated the house anyway. Not the full spread like I used to when Caleb and Ivy would visit, but just enough. A small tree in the corner, a string of lights on the mantel, and the same ceramic angel Robert gave me our last Christmas together. It was quiet, but it was still mine, and I found a strange peace in that. Jasper watched from the couch as I hung ornaments, occasionally lifting his head at the sound of the radio playing carols. Every now and then, I'd catch myself pausing, half expecting a knock on the door or a phone call that wouldn't come. The truth was, I didn't know if I was still hoping or if the habit of waiting had just etched itself into me. Either way, the silence remained. I wrapped one gift, labeled it, "To me, from me," and placed it under the tree with shaky pride. Sometimes, loving yourself has to be enough. The shelter threw a little holiday party for the volunteers on the 15th. There were store-bought cookies and mismatched mugs of cider, and someone brought their accordion-playing uncle who insisted on singing old sea shanties. It was awkward, hilarious, and somehow exactly what I needed. Maribel gave each of us a small tin of treats and a handwritten card. Mine said, "Thank you for showing up with your whole heart." I hadn't realized how much those words meant until I got home and read them again in the glow of my Christmas lights. I used to show up like that for my family, and maybe that's what made the loss so hard to carry. It wasn't just the rejection. It was the absence of anywhere left to place all the love I still had to give. At least at the shelter, there were mouths to feed and paws to hold. At least there, love had somewhere to go. One evening, I found a voicemail from Lorna. She said her son's anniversary was coming up, and would I mind coming over for tea and distraction? I bundled up, brought 2 scones from the bakery, and walked to her house with Jasper trotting at my side. She lived alone in a cottage tucked behind the high school, her front porch lined with wind chimes and birdhouses. We talked about everything but grief for the first hour. Books, shelter gossip, the weather turning too quickly. Then, over lukewarm chamomile, she finally said it. "I still dream of him sometimes, whole and alive." I nodded because I knew what that meant. I still dream of Caleb as the boy who collected pine cones and cried when his goldfish died. The boy who once told me, at age 9, that I made the best grilled cheese in the world. The man he became rarely visits me in dreams. By the week of Christmas, the mail had stopped feeling hopeful. No card from Caleb. No drawing from Ivy. No sign that I existed in their version of the holiday season. I didn't cry, but I did sit a little longer at the window each evening, watching the lights flicker across neighboring roofs. Some houses glowed like storybooks. Big wreaths, inflatable snowmen, families laughing in the driveway. Mine looked cozy, I suppose, but small, self-contained, like a snow globe no one had shaken in a long time. I made cocoa, added extra marshmallows, and watched a movie I'd seen a dozen times. It was lonely, yes, but it didn't hurt as much as it used to. Christmas morning arrived in shades of gray, with frost covering the porch rail and birds pecking at the empty feeder. I gave Jasper a new toy, a squeaky squirrel that he loved immediately, and scrambled eggs with a slice of ham for breakfast. There was no rush, no noise, no footsteps thundering through the hallway. Still, I opened my little gift and smiled at the scarf I'd bought myself from the catalog 2 months ago. It was soft and burgundy and wrapped just the way I liked, with tissue paper and a ribbon. I wore it while walking Jasper through the park, where a few families were already building snowmen near the frozen pond. A boy about Ivy's age was skating with his parents, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. But then he fell, laughed, and got back up again, and I realized it wasn't her. It didn't have to be her. My life didn't have to stop just because they walked out of it. Later that afternoon, June called from Florida, where she was visiting her oldest. "Are you okay?" she asked, skipping the pleasantries. I told her about the scarf, the cocoa, and Jasper Squirrel. She listened like always, then said, "I hope he regrets this someday." I didn't answer her, because wanting someone to feel guilt is its own kind of weight. And I was trying to carry less, not more. We talked about nothing for a while, then hung up with the usual, "Love you, talk soon." She didn't ask about Caleb again, and I was grateful. Some things don't need repeating to remain true. In January, I signed up to teach a writing workshop at the shelter. Maribel said it would be good for the younger volunteers, many of whom needed elective credits for school. I wasn't sure what I could offer at first. I hadn't taught anything since a brief stint as a Sunday school substitute in the 80s. But I brought in journals, gave prompts, and let them write without rules. We laughed more than I expected. One boy wrote an epic poem about a 3-legged pit bull who solved crimes. A girl wrote a letter to her future self in Paris. Sometimes, they stayed after just to talk. About nothing, about everything, about how writing made things feel less impossible. It reminded me of the power of being heard, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Even if my family couldn't see me, these kids did. And that mattered. I started leaving my phone in the drawer during the day. It buzzed less now, mostly spam calls and pharmacy reminders. But it was easier not to hope if I didn't keep checking. I had gone 61 days without hearing from Caleb. not counting that unsigned birthday card. And at some point, I'm not sure when, I stopped waiting. Stopped expecting the apology, the explanation, the miracle. It didn't mean I'd stopped loving him. It just meant I wasn't going to let his silence write the rest of my life. I was still here, and that was worth something. It was late January when I ran into Ivy's teacher at the grocery store, entirely by accident. Ms. Landry had taught Ivy in 2nd grade and always remembered me as the grandma who brought banana bread on parent days. She smiled when she saw me by the apples, a warmth in her face that caught me off guard. "I haven't seen you around school this year," she said gently, not accusing, just observing. I nodded and told her I'd been keeping to myself lately, simplifying things. "Oh," she said, like she understood more than I'd said aloud. "Ivy's doing well," she added, her voice softening. I smiled because it hurt too much to ask what, well, meant anymore. We talked for another minute or two about the weather and the price of pears, and then parted with a wave. But her words lingered like perfume on my sweater for the rest of the afternoon. At home, I sat by the window and watched Jasper chase a squirrel that always outsmarted him. I wondered if Ivy ever talked about me, if she asked why I didn't come around anymore. Or maybe she didn't notice. Maybe I had faded quietly, like a song at the end of a playlist. I remembered how she used to draw hearts around my name when she made handmade cards. "Best Grandma Ever," in big block letters, usually under a scribbled rainbow. I still had every one of them in a box beneath my bed, though I hadn't opened it in months. Sometimes love is like that, stored carefully, protected, even when it has nowhere else to go. Jasper came to sit by my feet, resting his head on my slipper, the way he always did when I got too quiet. I reached down and stroked his ears, whispering, "I'm still here, you know." He wagged his tail once, like he believed me. Lorna invited me to her church's winter potluck that weekend. I almost said no, out of habit, out of comfort, but changed my mind at the last minute. The basement smelled like chili and apple cobbler, and the tables were decorated with snowflake cutouts made by the children's class. Everyone was friendly in the way small-town people often are, curious without being nosy, warm without being invasive. I sat between Lorna and a woman named Diane, which made introductions amusing. She was a retired nurse with a sharp tongue and a booming laugh, and by the end of the night, we were swapping recipes. It was the first time in months I'd eaten in a room full of strangers and felt entirely welcome. Nobody asked about Caleb. Nobody tiptoed around my last name or family status. They just passed the cornbread and asked if I wanted seconds. Later that night, while Jasper curled against my leg on the couch, I stared at the fireplace and thought about how much I'd changed. I didn't feel stronger. Exactly. That word always seemed too neat for something so messy. But I felt sturdier. Like I could carry the ache without letting it hollow me out. Like maybe surviving rejection was just another part of the journey. I still loved Caleb. That part hadn't faded, but the need to be loved back in the same way, that had quieted. Not disappeared, but softened, like a bruise that still hurt when pressed but no longer made you wince. February rolled in with sleet and heavy winds that rattled the windows at night. I took comfort in routines. Tea in the morning, shelter shifts on Tuesdays and Thursdays, writing group every other Saturday. My days weren't full, but they were mine, and that made all the difference. Maribel asked me to help train a new volunteer named Lacey, not that Lacey, a much younger one who loved cats and quoted poetry. We bonded over a shared dislike for dishwashing duty and a mutual love of lemon squares. It was strange talking to someone so young who still asked about her grandmother like she was magic. "She always knew when something was wrong," the girl said once, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I used to think she was psychic." I smiled and said, "We're not psychic. We just pay attention." Valentine's Day arrived, with pink cards at the shelter, and too many leftover cupcakes from Maribel's niece's class party. I took one home for Jasper, scraping off the frosting before giving it to him. There were no cards in my mailbox, but I'd stopped expecting them long ago. Instead, I wrote a note to myself, a little thing on a yellow sticky that said, "You are still lovable, even when no one says it." I put it on the bathroom mirror. It wasn't magic. But it helped. And every morning after that, I read it aloud, like a promise I was learning how to keep. Sometimes, we have to say the things we most need to hear. By late February, the writing group had grown to 11 people. We started rotating leaders, and I found myself leading the prompt session one gray Saturday. The prompt was, "A door you once opened that you now regret." Most people wrote about relationships, job choices, or literal doors that led to hard lessons. When it came my turn, I read slowly. I opened the door to silence, thinking it was mercy. I didn't realize it would echo so long. No one said anything at first, which made me nervous. But then the girl next to me, a college student named Bria, said, "That was beautiful. Sad, but beautiful." And somehow that was enough. Not because it changed anything, but because it reminded me that pain shared is pain softened. Even grief deserves witnesses. That night, I finally opened the box under my bed. Inside were cards, crayon drawings, and a picture of Ivy with jelly on her chin and a crown of daisies on her head. I held it like it might vanish. She'd been 7 when I took that photo. Just 7, laughing in the sun, unaware that one day I'd be gone from her life without warning. I didn't cry. Instead, I whispered, "I hope you remember." Then, I tucked everything back into the box and slid it gently into place. Some memories are too sacred to carry around all the time, but they still belong to you, even in the dark, even in silence. March came in with wet shoes and a sky the color of dishwater. The snow had mostly melted, revealing muddy lawns and forgotten wrappers stuck to the thawing sidewalks. I started planting seeds in little cups on my kitchen windowsill. Basil, thyme, and cherry tomatoes for when summer finally decided to return. Jasper sat by my feet as I worked, his head resting on my ankle like it belonged there. I told him all about the plants, about how we'd need to move them outside when the frost passed, and he listened like he always did. It was one of the only conversations I had each day that didn't leave me feeling lonelier than when I started. The writing class had slowed down, midterms, travel, or just the rhythm of life pulling people away. But I still showed up with cookies and prompts and that quiet hope that someone might need what I brought. Sometimes one person came, sometimes none. One afternoon while sweeping the porch, I spotted a familiar figure walking down the other side of the street. It was Caleb. His gait hadn't changed. Still purposeful, still slightly lopsided from the old soccer injury. He wore a gray coat and didn't look up as he passed, his eyes fixed on the sidewalk, earbuds in. I froze, broom in hand, unsure whether to call out or hide. Instead, I simply stood there and watched him walk past like a stranger. He didn't glance my way, didn't turn, didn't stop. My hands were trembling when I stepped back inside. Jasper nudged my leg, sensing the shift in me, always alert to my moods like a living barometer. I sat down slowly, breathing like I'd just escaped something, or maybe lost something all over again. I hadn't expected to see him, not after all this time, not walking casually through my part of town. I wondered if he'd taken a new route to work or if he had something else nearby now. A new friend, a new errand, a new life. I told myself it didn't matter, that it meant nothing. But the image of him, older, unchanged, unreachable, stayed lodged in my chest like a thorn. Some people leave without saying goodbye, and then they pass by like the goodbye never mattered. That night, I wrote a letter I never expected to write. Not to Caleb, but to myself. It began simply, "You didn't fail." And I kept going, through the guilt, through the ache, through the memories that made my stomach tighten and my eyes burn. I wrote about the time I stayed up with him all night, when he had the flu and couldn't stop shivering. I wrote about how I clapped too loudly at his middle school talent show, how I stayed behind to clean up confetti no one else bothered with. I reminded myself that I had shown up, again and again and again, and that maybe being forgotten didn't mean I was forgettable. April brought crocuses and robins, and for the first time in months, I heard laughter from the house next door. New neighbors had moved in, a couple with twin toddlers and a basset hound named Cookie. They introduced themselves with a plate of lemon bars and an apology for the noise, which made me smile more than it should have. I told them I had no problem with noise, and meant it. They reminded me of a younger version of myself and Robert, full of plans and paint samples and sleep deprivation. I didn't tell them about Caleb, didn't mention the silence. Some stories don't need to be shared until there's someone who knows how to hold them. And they weren't ready for that wait. Jasper made fast friends with Cookie, and suddenly our morning walks had a little more energy. We'd meet in the driveway, leash in hand, and stroll the block like we had a purpose again. The twins waved every time we passed their window, their sticky fingers leaving marks on the glass. It was chaos and it was joy. Sometimes that's the only difference, whether you're inside the noise or outside the silence. The mother, Elaine, asked one day if I had grandchildren. I said yes, then changed the subject. Because the truth wasn't a single sentence anymore. It was 100 pages of silence. At the shelter, Rosie the puppy was adopted by a retired firefighter with a crooked smile. Thatch the beagle finally stopped barking during show tunes and found a home with a jazz musician. Even the shy tabby, Pickles, went home with a family of 5. The board, near the front desk, filled with photos of happy faces, holding their new companions. I added little captions to each one: Rosie's big adventure, Thatch's next chapter, Pickles finds her people. I wrote them in colored marker with hearts and paw prints, and Maribel said they made everyone smile. There was something healing in that, watching something unloved become wanted again, watching something that was left behind find its way forward. I wondered if people could do that too, if mothers could. By mid-April, the seedlings were tall enough to transplant. I spent an afternoon kneeling in the dirt, patting soil around roots with a gentleness I hadn't known I still possessed. Jasper sprawled beside me, belly up, sun-drenched and content. The garden wasn't much, just a few pots and a raised bed by the fence, but it felt like mine. Something I'd made, something I could tend, something that would grow, because I gave it time and care. When I finished, I sat on the porch with iced tea and let the quiet wrap around me like a soft shawl. It wasn't silence anymore, not the kind that wounds. It was peace. And for the first time, I believed I'd earned it, not because I'd let go of the pain, but because I'd made room beside it. If you're still listening to my story, please take a moment to subscribe. It only takes a few seconds for you, but it makes a big difference for me. May brought warm mornings and the scent of lilacs from the neighbor's yard drifting through my open windows. I took to sitting outside in the early hours, coffee in hand, watching the sky shift from gray to pale gold. Jasper would lie beside me, his head resting on my foot, his ears flicking at bees and faraway birds. Sometimes Elaine would wave from across the lawn, baby monitor clipped to her jeans, cheeks already flushed from chasing toddlers. We didn't speak much, but the wave was enough. A nod to say, "I see you, you're still here." There was something deeply comforting in that, being seen, even without explanation, without retelling old sorrows. Just seen, and left alone in a way that didn't feel like abandonment. On the 10th of May, a letter arrived. Not a card, not an email, not a voicemail or a typed apology, but a real handwritten letter. The envelope had my name in Caleb's blocky print, the same he'd used on gift tags as a child. My heart raced before I even opened it. I didn't know whether to expect blame, regret, or a list of grievances dressed up as concern. I stood at the kitchen counter for 10 full minutes, letter unopened, as Jasper watched me like he knew something sacred was in my hands. Finally, I opened it. The first line read, "I don't know how to start this without sounding like a coward." And I exhaled, because that meant it wasn't a performance. It was something real. He wrote for 3 pages, front and back, in slightly smudged ink and uneven spacing. He said he'd written the message back in October during a fight with Lacey. Said she'd accused him of being too available to me, of being pulled between loyalties he hadn't known how to balance. He didn't blame her directly, but the undertone was clear. She wanted space, and he gave it to her by giving me silence. He wrote that he didn't expect me to forgive him. He didn't even know if I'd read the letter. But I needed to try, he wrote. He didn't ask to visit, didn't say he missed me, Just wrote, "I'm sorry, I was wrong," and signed it with love. I sat down at the table and read it again, slower this time, letting each word soak instead of sting. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. What I felt was something closer to relief. Not joy, not restoration, but a loosening. Like something had finally been acknowledged that I'd spent months trying to pretend hadn't broken me. I folded the letter and set it next to my tea, unsure what to do with it just yet. Not ready to write back. Not sure I wanted to. But also, not ready to burn it. There are apologies that heal and apologies that leave a mark. His was both. Later that afternoon, I told Lorna about the letter over a shared slice of apple pie. She didn't ask to read it. She just listened, nodding in that way only someone who's lived through estrangement can. "You don't owe him anything," she said gently. "But it's okay if part of you still wants something from him too." I admitted I did. Not a relationship, not a return to Sunday dinners, but acknowledgement. To be seen not as someone he had to step away from, but as someone who had been worth holding on to. Lorna reached across the table and squeezed my hand, the same way she had the first day we met. "Sometimes closure doesn't come from conversations," she said. "Sometimes it comes from knowing they finally saw the door they closed." That night, I left the letter on my windowsill beside the seedling trays. I wanted the morning light to hit it, to make it feel less heavy, less like something hidden. I told Jasper what Caleb had written, even though he couldn't understand the words. He thumped his tail once and rested his head in my lap. I think that was his version of forgiveness. Simple, immediate, unconditional. I wondered what it would take for me to find mine. Not because Caleb deserved it, but because I did. Because forgiveness wasn't about restoring the past. It was about lightening what I carried into the future. Over the next week, I didn't rush to respond. I took walks. I baked lemon bread for Elaine and helped her pick out birthday balloons for the twins. I replanted the tomatoes, now tall and eager to climb. I read poetry before bed and wrote in my journal without censoring myself. I let life happen without waiting for the next letter, the next word, the next wound. And in doing so, I found something better than clarity. I found stillness. Not the kind that comes from absence, but the kind that comes from no longer needing to fill every silence with hope. Eventually, I wrote Caleb back. It was a short letter, just 1 page, and I kept it honest. I told him I'd read his letter, that I believed he meant every word. I told him I appreciated the apology, even if it came late. I didn't offer a visit. I didn't ask about Ivy. I just said, "I'm doing okay. I hope you are too." Then I folded it, placed it in an envelope, and walked it down to the mailbox. It was out of my hands after that. And that felt right. The letter I sent didn't come back. No call, no text, no second reply from Caleb. Just silence. But this time it didn't feel cruel. It felt like the kind of silence that follows after something necessary has been said. Like the space left behind after closing a door gently. I didn't wait by the phone, didn't check the mailbox with trembling hands. I simply went on, watering the garden, folding towels, reading with Jasper curled up beside me. I'd spent months expecting his absence to undo me, but it hadn't. Instead, I'd built a life around it. Not in spite of him, but without needing him. It wasn't about bitterness anymore. It was about permission. Permission to let go without pretending I never cared. June called a few days later to tell me she was planning a visit in June for my birthday. "I'll bring the peach cobbler and you handle the wine," she said, and I could hear her smile over the phone. I agreed, even laughed when she offered to bring sparklers like we were turning 12 instead of 65. We didn't talk about Caleb. She'd learned that boundary, and I appreciated her for honoring it. Instead, we talked about her niece, a new neighbor who owned a parrot, and the odd satisfaction of weeding flower beds. It was the kind of normal conversation I used to have before everything fell apart. And when we hung up, I didn't feel that hollow ache I used to. I felt full, maybe not of joy, but of something steadier. Peace, maybe. That weekend, Elaine asked if I'd like to help at the twins' birthday party. She said she didn't have many hands and would love a bonus grandma to wrangle balloons and keep juice boxes from spilling. I agreed without thinking, and then panicked briefly at the idea of being surrounded by children again. But the party was chaos in the best possible way. Frosting in hair, confetti in shoes, tiny hands grabbing at cupcakes. One of the twins, Hannah, took a liking to Jasper and insisted on feeding him every carrot stick from her plate. He accepted each one like it was gold. After the candles were blown out, Elaine pulled me aside and hugged me tight. "Thank you," she whispered, and her voice cracked. It had been a long time since I felt truly needed. That night, I dreamed of Ivy for the first time in months. She was older in the dream, maybe 13, with her hair in a long braid and a worried expression. She handed me a drawing, a frog wearing a crown, and said, "I didn't forget." When I woke up, my cheeks were wet and the sunlight was too bright. I sat on the edge of the bed and told myself it was just a dream, that she hadn't said those words, hadn't remembered. But the ache was so real I could taste it. Jasper sat by the door waiting for our walk, tail wagging gently, unaware of my heartbreak. I reached for the leash, breathing through the knot in my chest. There are dreams that heal and dreams that haunt. This one did both. By the time June arrived for my birthday, the garden was in full bloom. The tomatoes were stubborn, the basil thriving, and the cherry blossoms along the street were almost too perfect to believe. She brought the promised cobbler and 3 bottles of wine, which we didn't finish but made a good dent in. We ate on the porch, listening to the crickets and laughing about nothing, until it felt like a holiday. She gave me a photo album titled People Who Actually Showed Up, filled with pictures of Jasper, Lorna, Elaine, and even the twins. It made me laugh so hard I snorted wine, which only made her laugh harder. Later, as we cleaned up, she looked at me and said, "You're doing okay, Diane. I'm proud of you." And for the first time in years, I didn't argue. I just nodded and let the warmth settle in. In early July, I received a package on my doorstep with no return address. Inside was a small hardcover book with a green leather spine and a yellow ribbon bookmark. No note, no explanation. Just a book titled Grandma's Garden Recipes. I opened it slowly, unsure what I was about to feel. Every page was handwritten in Ivy's shaky cursive. The first recipe was my banana bread, copied exactly, right down to the pinch of nutmeg, not too much. Then came peach cobbler, rosemary chicken, even hot chocolate with peppermint sticks, labeled Christmas Eve Tradition. At the end, there was a drawing, a big heart around 2 stick figures, one with gray hair, the other with braids. In the corner, a sentence. I told Dad I wanted to send this. I hoped that was okay. My knees gave out, and I sat on the floor, holding the book like it was made of glass. I didn't call Caleb, didn't write back, but I wrote a letter to Ivy, my first to her, not for the box. I told her the book was the best gift I'd received in years, that the recipes were perfect, and the drawing made me cry in the good kind of way. I didn't mention the silence or the gap or the ache between us. Just said that I loved her, always had, always would. That nothing she'd done or hadn't done changed that. I mailed it to her school, where I knew it would be placed gently in her hands. Some bridges rebuild themselves, one board at a time. The rest of July was uneventful in the best possible way. Jasper chased butterflies and slept in the sun, Elaine brought tomatoes from her garden, and I read 4 novels without falling asleep once. Maribel announced she'd be leaving the shelter to move closer to her daughter, and I cried harder than I expected at her goodbye party. She hugged me tight and said, "You gave us all something steady, Diane. Don't forget that." I promised I wouldn't. Not this time. Not now that I finally knew how to stay steady for myself. Life didn't look like it used to, but that didn't mean it had stopped growing. It just meant I'd learned how to grow with it. August began with a heat wave that made even the early mornings feel thick and heavy. Jasper spent more time indoors, sprawled on the cool tile near the fridge, his water bowl always freshly filled. I started rising before the sun, just to sit on the porch in the faintest whisper of breeze and remind myself that the world still turned. The garden began to wilt in patches, despite my best efforts. Some things don't bloom forever, and that's not failure, it's just life. Ivy hadn't written back, and I didn't expect her to. But I did find myself glancing at the mailbox with a softness I hadn't felt in months. It was no longer hope that tugged at me, but something quieter. Possibility, maybe, and that was enough to keep going. Elaine invited me to her book club, and I accepted, even though I hadn't read the book. They didn't care. I brought lemon bars and listened, and that counted as contribution. No one mentioned family once, and I was grateful. By mid-month, a new family moved into the house 2 doors down, young, with a baby and a wind chime that clanged against my bedroom window. I offered them a pie I'd baked that morning, and the husband blinked at me like I was from another century. Still, they thanked me, and I left feeling oddly triumphant. I was no longer doing things to earn love, to stay relevant, to be remembered. I was just being who I'd always been, someone who shows up with something warm in her hands. That shift felt seismic, even if no one else noticed. I spent that evening journaling by candlelight, not because the power was out, but because the glow made everything feel a little kinder. Jasper lay nearby, chasing squirrels in his sleep, paws twitching in quiet delight. I reached over and rested my hand on his side, feeling the steady rise and fall. "Still here," I whispered and meant it. Toward the end of August, I received an envelope addressed in careful, small handwriting. Inside was a postcard, a sketch of a frog in a red hoodie holding a sunflower. On the back, in Ivy's unmistakable handwriting, it read, "Grandma, I'm learning to cook. Dad says I can make banana bread next week. I miss you." Just that. No return address. No way to reply. But my heart broke open in a way that felt like sunlight spilling through a cracked door. She remembered. She was still mine, even if just in a sliver of her heart. I held that postcard like a prayer for the rest of the day, carrying it from room to room, not ready to let it go. When I finally placed it in the box beneath my bed, I added a new envelope beside it, a fresh letter to Ivy. I didn't know if she'd ever see it, but I wrote it anyway, because love that is held quietly still deserves to be spoken. I told her that I was proud of her, that banana bread is magic, and that I hoped every slice made her feel brave. I told her Jasper still waited by the door on Sundays, and that the garden was struggling but not giving up. I told her that remembering someone is a kind of kindness, even when you're not sure if it's allowed. And I reminded her that even if I wasn't nearby, I was always rooting for her. Always, no matter what. That night, I sat on the back porch with a blanket over my knees, sipping tea that had gone lukewarm in the summer air. The crickets were loud, the stars mostly hidden behind clouds, but everything felt full. Not perfect, never perfect, but honest and still and mine. The silence no longer buzzed with absence. It simply existed. I'd stopped trying to fill it with apologies or noise or explanations. Now, I just let it breathe beside me. Jasper snored quietly on the porch rug, his chin resting on a stuffed squirrel. The night didn't promise anything new. It didn't have to. I was already enough. In September, I finally framed one of Ivy's old drawings, a frog with a crown, smiling too big for its little paper world. I hung it by the kitchen window, next to a hook where I kept my apron and a sprig of dried lavender. It felt like reclaiming something. Not the past, but the love that lived there. Caleb hadn't written again, and that was okay. Some relationships don't repair. They shift, stretch, or settle into stillness. I didn't need him to come back. I just needed to know I hadn't imagined it all. And now, I knew. He was real. And so was I. Jasper turned 7 that fall, his muzzle dusted with gray, and his legs a little slower up the stairs. We celebrated with a walk through the park and a peanut butter biscuit shaped like a bone. I sang to him like I always did, off-key and too loud, and he wagged his tail like I was the only voice that mattered. That evening, I lit a candle and made soup, the kind Caleb used to call Mom's Miracle Stew. I ate alone, but not lonely. The postcard stayed in the box. I didn't check the mailbox twice a day anymore. Didn't need to. Some gifts arrive when you're not looking, and some stay long after the wrapping is gone. The day the first leaf fell from the maple tree in my yard, I stood beneath it and watched it drift to the ground. It was golden, papery, curling at the edges like it had something to say. I bent down, picked it up, and tucked it into my journal between 2 blank pages. Maybe I'd write about it later. Maybe I wouldn't. Not everything needs to be remembered in words to be real. Some things live quietly in the spaces between, like a letter you never expected, like a voice you still hear, like the child who whispered, "We need space," and the mother who finally learned to breathe. Thank you for listening to my story. Before you leave, there's another story similar to the one you just watched. You'll see it on the top left of your screen.